And this is a little bit of an experiment. This more sort of informal webinar / gathering brought to you by the Correct Shelter Medicine Program and the Million Cat Challenge. But just wanted to say there's a lot of resources aggregated from elsewhere, from the University of Wisconsin website, from the University of Florida, and from our collective experience with managing panleukopenia. So I've gathered the material, but I haven't necessarily generated all of this material. And I just wanted to start by, I sort of said this is partly a Million Cat Challenge thing. And for those of you who are part of the Million Cat Challenge, and even if you're not, you know that we've experienced a big increase in life-saving success for cats in shelters, certainly hugely since I began and since I began doing shelter medicine, and even in just the last few years. And it's changed the kinds of health risks that we contend with as veterinarians. And I think it's changed somewhat what success looks like and and in some ways it challenges our comfort level, I guess. So when you're down here, where in your community or in your shelter, you're really still struggling just to save the healthy cats and kittens, and you're euthanizing the underage, the feral, the sick, the older cats, you can maintain a very low level of health risk and, having panleukopenia like never appear unless it comes in, the cat comes in with it is really a realistic goal. But then as you sort of pick off more and more categories, the risk, which is represented by this red line, and this is just non-linear, obviously, but it starts to go up. I mean, not so much with feral cats, but when you start working on underage kittens, bottle babies, you're going to see more health risk. And that can be a reasonable thing. It can be a good thing to say, yes, we're going to accept a little bit more disease because we're going to save a whole lot more kittens. And then again, you could only transfer in or bring cats in from very safe communities and very healthy shelters. But if you're working with the areas of higher need, you're going to see even more risk. And so, you might go from saving 100 kittens and no panleukopenia to 1,000 kittens and 20 cases of panleukopenia. You're still 980 kittens ahead of the game. And then as we move even further, for some shelters, you sort of move into, wow, like all the sick and healthy cats and kittens from your region are taken care of, and you're really focusing on sick, injured, abused, and neglected cats which have their own individual health concerns, but maybe not so much risk for spread to each other. And certainly when you get into the area of like, all you're taking in is 300-year-old cats with every known chronic affliction, but they're immune to panleukopenia, in some ways the risk for spread within the population actually goes down, and you can spend your time becoming an expert in dental experiments and management of chronic ailments. So I wanted to start by saying that because I think for shelter veterinarians, sometimes it feels like failure when we see a severe disease like panleukopenia or ringworm or calicivirus. It's one thing if a cat comes in with it, but especially if it spreads a little bit within the shelter. And so just wanted to remind you all to be gentle on yourselves. Shelter medicine is just not a no-risk profession. So we do our best to mitigate risk. We don't just say like, well, let disease run rampant, but also know that some risk is part of saving the most lives. So kind of build it into your expectations. And think about, we'll talk about individual practices where maybe accepting a little bit more risk on the health management end actually leads to more success in terms of being able to move more cats and kittens through to positive outcomes. I'm going to pause for just a moment and see if I can see the chat a little bit here. Lisa, just text me if anybody has questions because I don't think I can see the chat. Sorry, everybody. This is just quickly the different tools that I'm going to talk about for panleukopenia. And some of the highlights of vaccination. It has to be modified live. I think you all know that. It needs to be subcutaneous at or before intake, really, truly. And it makes a huge difference if there's even a few hours delay. And if there's one cycle of cleaning that takes place between when a cat is admitted and when it's vaccinated, that is an enormous risk exposure, and it undermines the efficacy of a vaccine program. So that's the first place to look when you're seeing more panleukopenia than you think you should. Is vaccination really happening 100% at or before the time of intake? This was a small study in 1979, and this is in the notes, but that vaccine was rapidly and fully protected unless there was maternal antibody interference. So when kittens were put in an environment that had cats in all stages of panleukopenia, 24 hours after vaccination, they received some protection. And cats were protected against an intraperitoneal challenge at 72 hours. In this study, it only involved 28 kittens, so it wasn't a big study, but it was startling protection. And in a high-risk panleukopenia situation, we're vaccinating everything. Every kitten 1 pound or bigger, and all cats. And I would say when panleukopenia is a risk of illness is more than the risk of vaccinating a pregnant cat, a sick or injured or a feral cat concurrent with surgery. There is no risk that the vaccine is going to be ineffective due to the interference by surgery, and vaccinating a feral cat, even a single time, has the potential to provide long-term protection to that cat. So we're really vaccinating everybody. Repeating the vaccination every 2 weeks while in a high-risk environment, which includes a foster home that has a lot of kittens coming in and out, but also we just don't want kittens spending 2 weeks or even a week in a high-risk environment. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then no matter what environment they're in, you want to give the last vaccine at 20 weeks of age. And that's because we know that in some kittens born to a naturally infected mom who provided a lot of maternal antibodies to her offspring, maternal antibody persists to at least 14 to 16 weeks of age. And then we don't always know exactly what age kittens are. So to give us a little bit of wiggle room and safety, make sure that they get a last vaccine when they're about 5 months old. And just to know, if you see panleukopenia spread amongst adult cats in a shelter, the first thing to do is personally go and observe vaccines and vaccination. So go to the refrigerator, pull out the box of vaccines, put on your glasses if you need to, and make sure they are modified live. Several times in outbreaks that took the lives of more than 50 cats, this has happened to me twice at least, we were at our wits' end thinking maybe it was vaccine-resistant strain, went to the refrigerator, pulled it out, and they'd been shipped killed vaccine by mistake. And standing there in the intake room with the manager holding that box of vaccine and crying is something I don't want anyone to have to experience again. So as soon as you see spread amongst adult cats, that's the first place to look. Is it live? And is it being given correctly? So double check and observe the vaccination process. Bottom line is that vaccination at or before intake with a modified live sub-Q vaccine every single time for every single cat really should drastically limit the amount of spread that you see within the shelter for cats over 5 months of age. So you should be very suspicious if you see it spreading in that population when you think you've got a good vaccine program. I hope this is all helpful. This is something that I think you all know, but it just bears reminding. I think when we see panleukopenia in kittens, there's a tendency to think like, oh, like did something go wrong with the vaccine? Did the kitten have not enough vaccine? But the problem really is with maternal antibody interference. So we know that kittens, if their mother was either vaccinated or exposed to panleukopenia, she will have some maternal antibodies to give. And the kittens will have different levels depending on how much they nurse. So some kittens might have a lot within a litter, some kittens might have a little. And then kittens born to a mother who had no vaccine because she was never, or no antibodies because she was never vaccinated and she was never exposed to field strain virus, she'll have 0 antibodies. And so the kitten will be born without any maternal antibodies. And so he won't have any to block the virus, but he also won't have any to block the vaccine. So the very first vaccine you give this kitten at 4 weeks of age, there's no antibodies on board. And so that vaccine is going to get in, and this is not a vaccine that needs to be boosted. So that kitten's going to receive just as much protection within 24 to 72 hours as an adult cat would. He doesn't need another vaccine. So that's different than, for instance, the upper respiratory vaccinations or feline leukemia vaccination that does need to be boosted for full effect. It's just a great vaccine that way. Now, what about this kitten that was born maybe to a mother who recovered from field strain Panleuk, and so she got a whopping dose of antibodies. And so she's up here in this area where the antibodies are above the minimum titer to block the virus and above the minimum titer to block the vaccine. So we vaccinate at 4 weeks of age, still way up here. Safe from virus, safe from vaccines. 6 weeks, still up here, way above the amount needed to block both the virus and the vaccine. But if this kitten happens to be in the shelter at the point where the antibodies have waned to the point that they're not protecting against the virus, but they haven't decreased to the point that we're able to get the vaccine through, the kitten is vulnerable. And every kitten, watch this closely, this animation, every kitten that starts out with some antibodies is going to pass through that window at some point between a few weeks old and about 16 to 20 weeks of age. There's going to be a time when they will catch Panleukopenia if they're exposed, and they can't be protected by vaccination. So we minimize that window by repeating the vaccination every 2 weeks to try and get it in as soon as possible after maternal antibodies have decreased. But we also have to minimize that risk by decreasing the amount of time that kittens are in shelters. Just to give you an idea of how common this might be, this is a study that the team from the University of Florida did a while ago that looked at the prevalence of protective antibodies to Panleukopenia in different age groups. And you can see that only 1/3 of kittens under 6 months old were coming in with antibodies. So bad news, they weren't protected, but good news, the very first vaccine is going to protect. And even when we get into 1 to 5 years and over 5 years old, we still only see about a little over half of cats coming into shelters with protective antibodies. So we know it's common that they aren't there. So bottom line, we know that the majority of kittens coming into shelters don't have maternal antibodies, and that very first vaccine will protect rapidly. But some kittens will have antibodies that block the vaccine until 16 to 20 weeks of age, and we don't know which is which. But we do know that more vaccines doesn't mean safer kittens, and we also know that less time in the shelter does mean safer kittens. So ideally, we have 0 holding time. For kittens that come into the shelter healthy, get a vaccine on board, get them up to adoption, or get them out to foster care with as little delay as possible. Very few kittens are going to get healthier in the shelter if they come in already looking good. At maximum, in most cases, I would recommend up to 72 hours just to assess the health and make sure there's not diarrhea, that they're eating well. If they've come in, especially from a high-risk neighborhood in your community, they're not looking perfectly robust, or they're transferred in from a high-risk shelter that is having some struggles with Panleukopenia. But don't hold kittens or cats back waiting for additional vaccines ever. Feel free to chime in if you have questions about any of this. I'm hoping some of this is sort of not news, and I'm hoping some of this is sort of helpful and different from what you already know. Probably goes without saying, but don't mix litters either in the shelter or foster care. If you are lacking foster homes, if it seems like you need to double up, really get in touch with us at the Million Cat Challenge to talk to people about just all kinds of great ways to increase the number of foster homes available. And also, all of our programs have ideas for how to decrease the length of stay in foster care. One of the most powerful and simple things to do If you're spaying and neutering at 2 pounds, it's to just drop the age of surgery weight to 1.5, a robust 1.5 pounds. And if you can cut the amount of time in foster by that much, oftentimes you can relieve the burden so you don't have to double up litters in foster care. So that's a place I would say, hold the line as shelter veterinarians. Mixing litters in shelters or foster care, too high a risk. And we all know that Panleuk is a fomite spread disease. It's incredibly durable, but some of you will have seen this and some of you will have seen it many times, but just to sort of make the point of, well, what is a fomite in a shelter environment? We took this device that measures organic matter contamination, and we measured it on the hand of someone who had come in to visit the shelter and was not cleaning and caring for cats all day, and found about 67,000 units of contamination. And then on the same square inch area on this staff member scrub top, who was in the middle of cleaning cats in single cages, so she had to really get kind of close and personal with them, 2.4 million units of contamination. So 35 times as much contamination on a staff scrub top as on a visitor's hand. And I have a question coming in from the chat sweetly texted to me from Lisa. Any hints on getting executive staff to understand the need to not mix litters? And I will say, I guess, a couple of things about it, and then hopefully we can discuss it once I have this slideshow done, and we can all see each other and I can see the chat. For one thing, understanding why does the executive staff want to mix litters? Is it that there's not enough foster families recruited? And so there's a feeling that to avoid euthanizing underage kittens, we have to mix them in foster homes? In that case, I would really work to solving that problem. First of all, by communicating with the public about when it is and is not appropriate to bring a litter of kittens into the shelter in the first place. And, certainly you can email us for more information about how to communicate that. And secondly, then by strategies to expand the number of foster homes available, starting with just asking every single person who brings a foster litter in and providing them with kitten care kits. So solving the problem that way. If the executive staff just thinks it's like so cute to see litters of kittens bounding about together, which I have seen as like, it's just such a draw to see several litters of kittens running around in a big window, or we have a group room and we want to use it to mix litters of kittens. Still, ideally, I would say, well, let's just put one litter in there at a time. They can still be really cute and we'll adopt that litter out and clean the area. If you're in a position where you must sometimes mix litters of kittens, and this is like by far the last choice, but if you have to mix sometimes, mixing litters of kittens that have already been in foster care for at least a couple of weeks and are robustly healthy and have no diarrhea, have already been observed and carefully screened for ringworm, that's the lowest risk of the different ways of mixing litters of kittens. So I hope that's helpful. And again, like, keep putting your questions into chat. It's terrific. And then another question that's being texted to me. This is so fun. What's your advice for mixing kittens if you have 2 singletons? And I would say there the behavioral risk outweighs the health risk. And I would say go ahead and mix apparently healthy singleton kittens so that they are co-housed with another kitten. This is a losing battle and a setup for panleukopenia and repeated outbreaks and lower life-saving success and despair. And one of my least favorite things to hear is that, this is what life-saving looks like, is to break out the crates and, just house more and more cats when the shelter gets crowded. Yes, in an emergency, when there's a fire and a whole bunch of cats have to come in, or something really unexpected happens, a planned transport gets canceled, do whatever you need to do to find some solutions. But long term, this is not a solution, and this does not help save more lives. Obviously there's all kinds of issues with this, but it's not possible to not have massive fomite transfer of Panleukopenia when this is the housing type. And so there's a tendency to think of like our better housing, our double compartment, more spacious housing as what we might use for adoption cats. But from a disease control perspective, then this is true for upper respiratory infection, of course, as well as Panleukopenia. Double compartment housing is most important for cats in their first 72 hours, while that vaccine is still coming on board for full protection. And also importantly, before you've had a few days to just observe their stool, observe whether they're eating, and get to know how the cat is doing. Once you know that they're robustly healthy, they're eating, drinking, peeing, and pooping normally, and they've had that vaccine on board for at least 3 days, you can relax a little bit and be more casual and less careful about your infectious disease control. But double compartment housing really facilitates true spot cleaning. And the idea should be during cleaning, when staff is most contaminated, when they're the biggest fomites, to minimize the amount of handling that occurs between cats. And I'm getting a few more questions about what if the singleton kitten comes in found by a member of the public and there's a nursing mom in-house getting ready to go to foster, euthanize the singleton. And I would say if it's a robustly healthy singleton and a robustly healthy litter and they're negative for feline leukemia, then it might be a reasonable choice to mix the kitten. I'm curious to hear what other people have to say. I don't know, Lisa, if you can unmute, because I don't feel like I have the last word on that. It used to be my policy that the foster kittens, the singletons, were euthanized, and it was not a popular policy with anyone, including me.
Julie says add the fat singleton to the nursing litter.
Okay, we're adding fat singletons to nursing litters. And I think that's, and it's a great way of putting it. If the singleton is already doing poorly, don't put the whole litter at risk, and don't feel terrible if you need to euthanize that singleton or raise it, see how it does, recognizing that it's a very high risk kitten. I'm going to talk a little bit about testing now. And again, just trying to move quickly and highlight some things that I think are important or maybe not obvious. For testing, the IDEXX brand snap test is appreciably more reliable in terms of having fewer false positives than other brands available. This was a study that Julie and her team did, and you can see this test, 1 out of 64 kittens that had been recently vaccinated tested positive on this was the IDEXX brand snap test, I believe. Julie, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So you can see there was quite a bit more false positives on the other brands of tests, so it makes sense to use the IDEXX brand, recognize that false negatives are possible. That's a parvo snap test. It's not designed for Panleukopenia. But false positives with that brand are unlikely, even in kittens and cats that have been recently vaccinated. If it doesn't match, if the clinical signs and the history and the test results don't line up, then PCR at a reputable laboratory makes sense. False negatives are very unlikely. That's a very sensitive test. But important to know that not all laboratories are created equal. And I just talked to someone on the phone recently who got a positive Panleuk result on a fecal panel from a laboratory where I've heard some concerns about the testing accuracy, and it didn't match up with the history of that particular cat or the clinical signs. And so still question, even if it's PCR, and particularly if it's a laboratory that you haven't verified with a shelter medicine program or a university has a good solid testing program for Panleukopenia.
Kate, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, this is Cinda. You may be getting ready to say this, so excuse my interruption if you are, but I think it's also important to know that two different studies have shown that PCR will detect very low amounts of vaccine strain Panleukopenia virus for up to 2 weeks post-vaccination. So you get a false positive with a PCR test on feces in cats or kittens that were recently vaccinated.
Thank you. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it's a possibility. So if it's negative, it's negative. You may get a false positive due to recent vaccination. Some laboratories may give you quantitative results. So you can say like, oh, it's a high load of virus, that's probably real. It's a low load, that could be either field strain or vaccine induced. But at any rate, a negative on PCR from a reputable lab is good and solid. And thank you, like Cinda, Julie, everyone attending, please feel free to chime in. An important thing that comes up sometimes, the SNAP test is not a screening test. It is not intended to screen for panleukopenia in incoming. So hold the line on that. Do not routinely test healthy appearing kittens. It's a waste of money. It will give you a false sense of security because although kittens can shed for a few days before they become symptomatic, the chances that you're catching them in that small window while they're shedding and positive and before they develop fulminant signs is small, and they might be shedding 6 hours after you test them and call them negative. So if you have kittens that a litter may develop panleukopenia and they're looking healthy, it's reasonable to say, well, that one's at high risk of being in the early stages of developing panleukopenia, might already be shedding, but otherwise don't use the test on healthy appearing kittens on a regular basis. Has anyone been pressured to do that?
Hey, can I chime in here?
Yep.
Hey, it's Beth Kessler from Peggy Adams down here in West Palm Beach, Florida.
Yeah.
We do routinely test every cat for panleuk with the SNAP test, and we've been doing that for 2 years. And you're right, it is a false sense of security. We only clinically per se treat those that are symptomatic, and if they are negatives on a parvo, we just move forward with it. So what you're saying is just to test those that are showing clinical signs, and just take it as they come, which could be just any type of diarrhea, which might lessen the amount we're doing, but anytime they have any abnormal stool, our parvo test would be warranted.
Yes. So reserve the parvo test for when you have clinical signs, and I would say some suspicion of panleukopenia. Be pretty free about it. You know, if it's a 3-year-old cat and it came in vaccinated and it's been in the shelter and you vaccinated on intake, it's still been vaccinated, it's been sitting around for a month and now it has diarrhea, maybe you don't test. But feel free to use the test when there's any whiff of suspicion, but save your money on the cats that come in healthy because they could have it if they were incubating. They could have it a day later and you're not going to test them every morning, you know, until they could be through the incubation period, right? Save that money.
Yeah, because I mean, right now, even those that are positive per se and asymptomatic, we just watch them and retest them in a week, which is like, you know, we're just very careful with our PPE and our fomite control, which is what we really stress within the shelter because we have a nursery and infant holding, so we have kittens in from 0 days to infinitum in our shelter. So, but that's a
What I would say is if you have good housing, you're doing true spot cleaning, you're doing good PPE between litters and between general populations, you're vaccinating on intake and you're doing good monitoring for health, that and testing when they're symptomatic, that will give you plenty of time to catch it.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So bottom line, and it sounds like this is pretty well accepted now, but I've heard people really suspicious of the positive SNAP test in recent vaccinated. Trust the positive SNAP test as positive if it's in a cat with consistent history and clinical signs. But if it really has very consistent signs and history, still be suspicious, even if it's a negative SNAP test. isolate those kittens and treat them as contagious until you've confirmed it one way or another with PCR or other testing. Would that make sense?
We usually recommend those with suggestive clinical signs that test negative on the first snap test to repeat the test on the next day also, because the virus is shed intermittently. So there is a possibility of a false negative test one day, and then it could be positive the next day.
I'm just going to add that to these slides right now. Isn't this fun?
And then I wonder how many people actually try to do a white blood cell count as another ancillary tool to help with diagnostics.
I do. I do.
That's great. I thought about putting that in. And I thought, you know, maybe because PCR is more available and pretty quick turnaround time, that's more used. But that's a great point that it is panleukopenia. And if they don't have a low white blood cell count on blood smear or on a CBC, then that doesn't absolutely rule it out. But certainly if they do have it, that's strongly increases your suspicion. One word of warning that salmonella can present very similarly. And the question about what about kittens that were previously SNAP positive, and I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to sort of testing for recovery in a little bit, kind of still lie along. There is some rationale for testing litter mates. And so we can see within a litter, as I said, different kittens will have different levels of maternal antibody. And so you can have one kitten that maybe was a poor nurser and didn't get very much. And so at the time of exposure, that one didn't have protective antibody, and so it gets really sick. And there might be a kitten in that litter that got a medium amount, and so it gets a little bit symptomatic, but it had some protection. And maybe another kitten in that litter that had enough maternal antibody at the time of exposure to be fully protected. So if you have litter mates of a kitten that got sick, do test, at least I think, test the litter mates. And if they are negative, realize that they might have been protected or they might be incubating, but they have panleukopenia on their fur. So bathe them and then quarantine them in a freshly sanitized housing. So they may be okay. If they're positive, but maybe not clinical or maybe a little bit clinical, separate them from the negative litter mates and monitor and treat them as needed. And they may have had partial protection, they may do okay, or they may progress to severe disease. And I'm sure some of you have had that experience. Somebody's driving. Now, here's another question that's really a tough one, I think, for us as shelter veterinarians. What to do when there's a case of panleukopenia, to quarantine or not to quarantine? And when I first encountered panleukopenia, like every time I had a positive SNAP test, I locked down at least the ward, stopped in and out, I stopped adoptions, cleaned it top to toe, put everyone in 14-day quarantine. And after like the first 5 times that no more cats broke with illness, I was like, do I absolutely have to do that? But it was scary not to do it. So you need to balance the negative life-saving impact of shutting down flow. Maybe a shelter is counting on you as their transfer partner, you know, or maybe there's intake from the community that otherwise is going to go to another shelter that's overburdened, or maybe those cats are going to be at risk out in the community if you don't bring them in. So you balance that life-saving impact with the risks of not responding robustly enough with a strong enough quarantine response and potentially allowing continued spread, or adoption of cats that end up breaking with panleukopenia in the adopter's home and, you know, crushing the adopter and negatively impacting your reputation. So it's not a no risk proposition either way, but generally if the shelter's not crowded, if you're doing great on vaccinating at intake, if you have double compartment housing, especially for cats that are first in the shelter, litters are housed separately, Monitoring for sick cats occurs pretty regularly, just like the person from Peggy Adams described. You're using a parvicidal disinfectant, and especially if the case occurred within about 3 to 5 days of intake, so it looks like it's not a homegrown case, and there's just one cat or kitten or litter affected, I'd say it's a safe bet to just go on, you know, maybe up your monitoring, up your suspicion, up the readiness with which you reach for a test, but don't necessarily quarantine. Anybody want to scream and yell and say, no, like I tried that and it was awful? Taking silence as possible agreement. So just, I want to give you permission. Sometimes not quarantining is the lower risk choice for overall life-saving success. Going back to testing, this is from Lisa, I think at Toronto. Another tip I just learned is to swab the tonsils first, then the rectal and fecal swab. Apparently shed in the tonsils first. I think subjectively it cuts down on false negative, but curious what others think. I'm gonna just put that tip out there and keep going, and we can discuss a little bit more at the end because I want to get through the rest. I just have a few more slides, I think. And just a little bit more, so that was sort of overall assessing whether the population risk is such that quarantine is warranted, but also even if you're going to do a quarantine, which cats and kittens do you consider meaningfully at risk at the time of exposure? And remember that in the UF study that I showed earlier, little over 50% of adult cats did have protective antibody even at the time of intake. And then additionally, we can expect that cats that have been vaccinated for at least about 3 days prior to exposure are going to be protected if they're over 20 weeks of age. So a lot of cats can be excused just based on vaccine history. And then if we want to check titers, a lot more cats can likely be excused from a quarantine. So that a positive protective titer from a validated laboratory is very predictive. And a negative titer from a validated laboratory means that the cat didn't have positive titers at the time that sample was taken, but if it was vaccinated prior to exposure, it still could be that the titers will outrun the actual infection in that cat. So a negative titer means quarantine. It certainly doesn't mean the cat is going to get sick. Positive titer means that cat is safe, and it might be a reasonable choice to just move it on with its little cat life. The secondary tests available for in-house use, the immunocomb, which is available for, has poor sensitivity. So supposedly the currently available test has been improved, but it hasn't been validated that I know of. Julie, correct me again if I've got this wrong. It has good specificity. So it's unlikely to tell you that a cat is protected if she's not. But if it says it's negative, she doesn't have protective titers, just know that cat might very well be protected and might well be fine. So you'll have to go ahead and quarantine more cats if you're using the in-house test than if you're sending it out to a validated laboratory. In kittens, at least precede the titer test with a SNAP test. And if they're SNAP negative and titer positive, that could be just maternal antibody that's going to wane the very next day. So get them out of the shelter quickly and recognize they're not as low risk as an adult cat with protective titers. Anything to add on that?
I was waiting for Julie. This is Cindy. I was waiting for Julie to speak up, but I think Katrin Hartmann in Munich, Germany, has evaluated the more recent version of the feline VaxiCheck for parvoviral antibody titers. The sensitivity had increased from 49% to over 80-something% in her validation. But the one thing I wanted to add, we've used the feline VaxiCheck test now in nearly 100 cats that were 5 months of age or older. And of those tested cats, they'd all had one vaccine at the time of exposure and blood collection. And 1 out of 3 did not have what's considered protective antibody titers to Panleukopenia. And this was similar to something that Brian DeGangi also published, where he found that 15% of adult cats didn't respond to the initial Panleukopenia vaccine. And 2 other studies found that the percentage was closer to 30%. So it is possible for adult cats to not have what's considered protective titers within the first 7 to 14 days after an initial vaccine.
And that is my understanding. But importantly, at least in my experience and in that study, of course, they were in the 1978, the small study that I mentioned that showed the protection at 24 and 72 hours. That was well before any titers would be expected. And yet the immune response to the vaccine apparently outpaced the spread, the systemic spread of the infection, and allowed the cats to mount a sufficient response to it. Sometimes we don't have titers, but we will see that actually the cats are protected against exposure, but good to be aware of.
Well, and I think it's also a very confusing point to most people is what you mean by protection, because there's 2 types. There's protection against infection or sterilizing immunity, and then there's protection against disease, but you could still be subclinically infected. And so within that first 72 hours, I think what's been worked out is that there's an innate immune response during that first week with all the antiviral interferons and cytokines that can help protect against clinical disease, but not prevent infection.
And I think that's probably a good distinction. And what I would say functionally is that in my experience, managing populations as if healthy cats over 20 weeks of age that have been vaccinated for 72 hours are protected is successful in preventing panleukopenia spread in shelters. So for instance, being a little bit more relaxed about like those cats can go into a get acquainted room and you don't have to disinfect the get acquainted room between cats, and you don't have to have people wash hands between handling cats that have been vaccinated for at least 72 hours. That's functionally effective. We don't see like, panleukopenia spread amongst those cats. So we don't have, the nuanced studies of really looking at where, was there some subclinical infection and maybe even some shedding? Very possibly. But was the overall vaccine protection of the population sufficient and the overall sanitation of the shelter sufficient to keep that from manifesting as illness? Yes, in my experience, if we treat it as if 72 hours is generally sufficient.
Kate, this is Sandra. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I share that experience, and what I suspect is happening in many cases is that we're seeing that protection before the antibody titer is actually detectable in some way. But that I share that same sort of clinical experience where if we use that as our guideline, things tend to go well in a shelter.
So we use the science as best we can, but then that's one of the reasons I wanted to share this is to just sort of provide the experience that we've had of hearing from a lot of shelters, either managing panleuk or not, and the outcome of many, many, many exposures, but also to give you an opportunity in the field to say like, well, we acted that way and it didn't work out.
The other thing I was going to say is that we also sort of have an idea that, subclinical infections happen in cats and kittens in animal shelters. But at least in our hands, when we're managing outbreaks, not taking those into consideration has worked for us clinically. So what we have come to think is that while subclinical infections are likely happening, that they don't appear to be in a shelter that's vaccinating and has other, you know, reasonably good practices. They don't appear to be super relevant clinically when you're responding to the outbreak, at least, again, in our hands and our experience.
And I think that's a great thing to just remind everybody of. If you're vaccinating, using a parvicidal disinfectant, not terribly overcrowded, and have reasonable monitoring, subclinical infections don't seem to be important. If you're not doing those 4 things, subclinical infections are the least of your worries.
Exactly.
And I think that's my worry, because actually the subclinically infected kittens or cats do shed virus. If you look at studies that have done virus shedding in correlation with measuring antibodies, whether they're present or not. When there is dissemination of the Panleukopenia virus in a shelter, it's usually because that shelter doesn't have good vaccination practices, or they don't have very good sanitation practices, and I'm worried about those subclinical ones under those conditions when contributing to the spread.
So I'm going to move on from this because I just have a few more slides to get through, and I want to get through this in our promised time frame. But just again, in our, at least in my experience and in a lot of experiences, vaccinating, using a parvicidal disinfection, monitoring, and avoiding overcrowding, even though subclinical infections may be present, panleukopenia does not manifest. So we work with many shelters that don't take precautions that include the subclinical infections and never have panleukopenia spread. If you don't have those things in place, the subclinical infections will be spreading, but so will the clinical ones. And so managing the tip of the iceberg, in my experience, helps to manage the base of the iceberg. Hope that makes sense. I have more time.
Yeah. It's Sandra. I don't want to take too much time. I just wanted to just add one little thing about that really in the end, and you know, Kate, you talk about this all the time, but I feel like what we really are talking about in a way is infectious dose, and that the infectious dose that's being delivered from those subclinical infections, I think in most cases is, again, is below the limit of what becomes clinically relevant if you can get to a place where your husbandry and your management practices support health.
Thank you all. Just moving on to get through the last few slides here. If you do decide that quarantine is warranted for those individuals where it is, go ahead and vaccinate. You know, if they're at that point in their little lives where they need a revaccine. It won't protect against prior exposure, but if they happen to get exposed during quarantine, may provide some protection. Ideally, break up litters into 2 or 3 so you don't have 6 kittens. You're trying to keep track of who's got diarrhea. Combine singles, as we said. Take precautions between each cage and restart the quarantine if the cat is still vulnerable. So say it was vaccinated at the beginning of the quarantine and then 5 days into the quarantine, another cat in the quarantine room broke, but now the vaccine has been on board for 5 days. You don't necessarily need to restart the quarantine for that cat. But on the other hand, if you have a kitten and 7 days into the quarantine, another litter of kittens broke, you don't know whether the other kittens in the room were protected by vaccination or not. So you need to restart the quarantine from the beginning for those kittens. I hope that makes sense. So obviously, fewer animals in quarantine lowers the risk that you're going to have to constantly have this sort of rolling quarantine happening. 14 days is to be on the safest side. That's the long end of incubation periods that we've seen. And what I've been told is that longer incubation might be associated with a low dose of exposure because there's a certain half-life that the virus has to go through a replication before it builds to the point where it goes systemic and creates clinical signs. And so if you start with a very, very low dose, then there's more half-lives of replication before it gets to that point. Or if there was partial protection from maternal antibodies on board and then that waned. On the other hand, if there's massive exposure, probably the incubation period in the great majority of cases for panleukopenia is under a week. And so if you know, like, these kittens were transported with another litter of kittens that broke with panleukopenia during the transport. And if they're not sick within 7 to 10 days, they're probably okay. So if you're really tight on space and you're needing to nuance it, just be aware of why we say 14 days to be on the safest side, and where you can say, well, all I can do is 7 days, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just sort of fly along to get through the rest. So I do really welcome your input. So please, like, jot notes for yourself. Shedding for greater than 2 weeks after recovery is uncommon. I used to think it didn't happen and acted as if it didn't, and we seem to get away with it. I'm not aware of reports of apparent ongoing spread from a cat or a kitten that was recovered more than 2 weeks, although it has been documented on occasion. If they were originally SNAP test positive, then it's a very reasonable choice to say, well, that was, it was positive. Retesting after complete resolution of clinical signs would give you even greater assurance that they're not shedding at a clinically important level. So a negative SNAP test means very low risk for a continued environmental decontamination. If you want to be super cautious, you can retest by PCR, but probably reasonable, in my experience, just waiting 2 weeks for complete resolution of clinical signs, which is probably something you'd want to do anyway for a cat recovering from a disease that potentially is serious. And then give the cat a bath to remove any contamination that might still be on the coat, and let it go on with its little cat life. Remembering, we don't operate in panleukopenia-free environments. That's why we need to make sure we have our sanitation and our vaccination and our monitoring, so that cats can withstand the low dose that is going to be present in a normal spay-neuter clinic shelter environment that takes cats in from unknown health backgrounds. I think that answered the question that I got. Decontamination. So it does live forever, or at least for potentially months or years if you don't remove or inactivate it. So no real benefit from shutting down areas. Instead, 3 full cycles of cleaning with like a good sudsy soap, elbow grease, removing organic material, disinfect and dry, and then put your initials on that and repeat. You can repeat that 3 times in a single day if you need to.
Want to go get it? Do you want to wait?
How long? Someone's not muted. And I could get into that. There's lots of information. You guys all know this, but accelerated hydrogen peroxide, I think really the best choice for this. At 1 to 16 for known contaminated areas where you can use it. Can you figure out who's unmuted, possibly? So if you can use it at 1 to 16, like on a contaminated cage, do. If you can't use it at that high of a concentration, then a longer contact time is beneficial. So if it's like a foster home carpet and they're not going to put it on at 1 to 16, then just leave it for 24 hours. For areas that can't be 100% disinfected, and I'm really thinking about foster homes here, balance the risk of closing a foster home versus the risk of keeping it open. And I have a link in this to a little article that I did on that for Maddie's Fund a few years ago that still is pretty good.
I want to be at Boys and Girls Club by 8.
Hey, Sandra, I think you're not muted.
Oh, sorry.
I'm not going to get into accelerated hydrogen peroxide, except just to say, like, don't let challenges with its use prevent you from using it. There's reason why it's really good for, and particularly if you're struggling with panleukopenia, because it can sanitize in 30 seconds. It doesn't completely eliminate virus, but it's more rapidly active than other disinfectants that we have readily available. And it's more active in the face of organic matter. So it's better for, say, like wiping down a counter or an exam surface. So just a tip, if it's too expensive, using it 1 to 64 for general and daily use, 1 to 32 between animals, and only using that 1 to 16 when there's high risk, like there's been Panleukopenia contamination. And if you see buildup from it that you don't like, know that that's actually the soap component of accelerated hydrogen peroxide. So you can't wash it off with soap, but you can rinse that ugly buildup with water. So just a couple of barriers that some shelters have to using it, but some of the ways around that. And here's a question. Are we not recommending giving a booster to adult cats now, or did I misunderstand? So that's a great question, going back to vaccination for Panleukopenia. For the most part, that great vaccine does not need to be boosted. And keeping animals back in a high-risk environment while waiting for a booster is much higher risk than the small additional benefit that may be provided by a booster in some animals. It is still recommended as a best practice that an animal that has never been vaccinated before receive a second vaccination for Panleukopenia within 2 to 4 weeks of the first vaccination. Whether that's truly boosting it in the way that we understand it with, say, calicivirus or feline leukemia, or just making sure that the vaccine is administered correctly, it's a life-saving vaccine that has a very long duration of protection. So I remember we went back and forth a little bit about, like, well, why is that vaccine repeated? But for one thing, you do need to repeat the respiratory components. They do need to be boosted for full protection. And it's given as part of a 3-way vaccine. And also just to have the most reliable possible protection from the most important component of that vaccine, since it's a fatal disease. Hope that answers that question. And then I have treatment last. Was hoping that we would have a little time to discuss that, and I can certainly stay on, or perhaps we carry this over to the Facebook group. But talking to, this is sort of where my expertise leaves off. Like, I try everything I can to tell you how to prevent it, and then if it gets past all of that, then we go to treating it. And certainly there are more and more shelters are treating cats and kittens with Panleuk. Evaluate whether you can do that safely in-house, or whether you could do it with a partnership, maybe with a veterinary clinic in your community that has adequate ability to monitor and care for the patient and make sure that there's no suffering involved. And for adopted kittens and cats, just important to plan ahead and communicate to adopters what you can do if they end up having a kitten develop Panleuk before they incur a $5,000 vet bill that then they're hoping that you can pay, that, maybe there's just not the budget for that. And so just going back to kind of what I said at the beginning about risk, this is something that my training officer told me when I first became an animal control officer. If you never get bit, maybe you're not trying hard enough. If you never see Panleukopenia, maybe you're not stretching your life-saving capacity as much as you can. But on the other hand, you also shouldn't be constantly getting mauled, right? Then it means if you're getting bitten every day, it means you're doing something wrong. And so ultimately, increased life-saving success comes with some increased health risks, but also we can't keep cats healthy if we're beyond capacity. And we just know it's against human nature to maintain capacity or prevent crowding when cats are being euthanized for space. And so balancing intake with live outcomes and with capacity ultimately is a foundation for preventing Panleukopenia. So all of the things that we've discussed are tools, but if it's a repeated occurrence, it's a symptom of an imbalance between capacity, intake, and the outcomes that you think are appropriate for the cats in your care. So a great guidebook on Panleukopenia that goes over a lot of this information, so a link there in the notes. Sign up for our newsletter at sheltermedicine.com. It's coming soon. It's been coming soon, to be fair, for 2 or 3 years, but we're really gearing up. And also, if you're not part of the Million Cat Challenge, you're welcome to join and sign up for our newsletter there to get more news on some of the things that we have discussed today.